and welcome to another episode of Wednesday Whimsy. My name is Kyle, and Wednesday Whimsy is a short show where I talk about a board game related topic, a top 10 list, sometimes something that's board game related. If you missed it, last week I did an episode about Marvel Zombies. It went up while I was on the cruise, so I wasn't able to sort of push it out, but it definitely went up, so you can check that out as well. But today we're not talking about that game. Today we're talking about an older game. A game that's so old that it's a classic in my opinion. When did the first one? When did it come out? Let's see if we can figure out that information here. It looks like this is a 2005 game. So, regardless of where you are in gaming, 2005 is a good almost 20 years ago, which is plenty of time for us to marinate on it. Now, I'm going to do something a little different today because the game I have here physically is a different version than the one I'm talking about. But the game is Twilight Struggle. Now, this version is Red Sea, Conflict in the Horn of Africa. That is the new 2023 version of Twilight Struggle, which is a condensed version, and I will talk about that in sort of the final rating section of this discussion. But the game I'm actually talking about is the old classic 2005 Twilight Struggle. Now, these two are compatible, so there's that as well. Anyway, let's sort of jump into Twilight Struggle. We'll talk a little about what it's about, how it works, and then I'll tell you my thoughts. So, what is Twilight Struggle about? Well, it sounds like it might need to be about vampires, and maybe that joke's too old now. But Twilight Struggle is a game about the Cold War. In the game, each player is going to be playing one of the two superpowers, the USSR or the USA, and you're going to be vying for control on a map of the world. Let's see if we can put that up here. Here we go. So you've got this map, and you're trying to gain control. You're trying to influence this, and sort of the core system of the game, which I'll talk about in a moment, is these historical events based on things that actually happened, and you're trying to sort of steer history in your favor. And you're going to take a game takes place over essentially the entire scope of the Cold War, from kind of the end of World War II up through the sort of tearing down of the Berlin Wall, and a little bit beyond when the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed. So let's talk a little bit about how it works. So the core mechanism of the game, it's sort of twofold. One is this map, and it's a very big map with lots of places that you can influence, and the other is going to be something called a card-driven game system. And what the card-driven game system does is, and I'm going to pull these out. And again, these are from the new version, but you can kind of see them. We have these. Let me close this window here, and then So you have these cards, and the cards are going to have a value in them, and they're going to have a color, either red or white, or some of them are red and white. And then they also have an event text and a picture that's based on something historical. So this card, for example, is a card from the Soviet Union. And you can tell that because the star is red. Whereas if it were a card from the US, it would have a white star, like this one. And some cards, as I mentioned, have kind of a two-colored star. On your turn, the game's going to be played over something called a turn, which is a series of a number of action rounds, 6 or 7, depending on where you are in the game, and sometimes even 8. Everyone's dealt a hand of cards. You're going to select one card to play just for its event, and then the game really starts. On your turn, you have a choice. You must play a card, and that card is going to determine what you're going to do. And you can either play the card if it's your own color, your own type of card, or a neutral card that applies to both players. You can play it either for its action points or for its text. And it's one or the other. Then if you play a card that belongs to the other player, only to the other player, you don't have a choice. You will play it for its action points, and the other player will get the benefit of the event. You just get to choose which happens first. And that's a fascinating decision here, because you kind of have this hand of cards, and you can see that they're always the wrong color. I mean, inevitably, that's the cards you draw are the cards that are the wrong color. But you're sort of planning them, and you're thinking, okay, if I play this card now, it's going to benefit the other player. But if I do this other thing first, they're not going to be able to get much benefit out of this. And so there's a lot of analysis that goes into sort of when you play those cards and what you do with them. Now, the actual actions you can do, there's really only, I guess, 4, I think is the right number. Let's go back to the map here. And, you can play the card just to influence, which means you pick a country where you already have influence, and you can add more influence to that country or to countries that are connected to it, sort of spreading out. And you can put your influence in a bunch of different places. You just have to have had the adjacency at the start of the turn. You can also, but if your opponent controls that country, which means each country has a little number on it. Let's see if we can zoom way in. Like you can see, for example, Canada here has a stability number of 4, whereas Mexico has a stability number of 2. If your opponent has that much more influence than you, then they control the country, and that means when you're putting your influence in it, you essentially pay double, 2 points of influence for each one you put in. Another thing you can do is you can do what's called a realignment roll, which is a less useful item, but you're going to be rolling a die and trying to remove the opponent's influence, and you do that by sort of controlling adjacent countries. You can also do a coup, which happens a lot, and is going to be, you're going to roll a die, and you're going to add to that die roll the value of the card you played, and then you're going to double the stability number and subtract the 2. And then if you succeeded, if you have, if the number of your die roll plus the card is more than double the stability, you're going to start removing your opponent's influence. Or if you're able to remove all the opponent's influence, you're going to start putting in yours. So a coup, for example, in Mexico can swing affairs to the side of one superpower or another. And these Central American states, they have low stability, so they're easier to coup in. And then the final thing you can do is there's this thing called the space race track, which represents, well, the space race, but it's kind of a way to flush a card. And so you're going to play a card with a certain value and roll a die. And if you succeed, if you get between a certain range, you're going to advance on this track. That unlocks some points or a special ability. But ultimately, the real value of it is it prevents the opponent's event from occurring. So if there's something that's going to be catastrophic for you, you can flush it in the space race to make sure it doesn't go off right now. Now, you can only do that once per turn of the game, which means basically a hand of cards, unless something else happens that lets you do more. But that's kind of how that works. Anyway, the ultimate goal is to have control of various countries when these scoring cards come up. And so in each deck of cards, there's going to be a couple of scorings, and it's going to be a card in your hand, and you must play it when it's in your hand. You can't hold it for the next hand of cards. You have to play it during that particular turn, which, remember, is a hand of cards. And then you're going to want to score by having control, by having presence or domination or control, which basically means controlling more of these certain specific battleground countries, these purple ones like Iran or Pakistan are important countries historically in these regions. And so, the two superpowers are going to go after them, whereas some countries might be more stable or might be less important. And there's, they're not as important to the scoring, although you also want to control those so that you can get these different control thresholds. And you'll see that there are points awarded for having these thresholds, and that takes us to the next phase, part of the game, which is this victory point track. There's only one victory point marker. And so whenever the Soviet Union gets a point, that's essentially taking a point away from the U.S. player. And, the reverse is also true. But if you're ever able to get your score marker all the way to 20, the game ends instantly and you win. So that's one way to win. There's another way to win. There's if you control Europe when the scoring card happens. Let's see if that should be over here. You just automatically win. And then there's also this DEFCON track, which is down here somewhere. And DEFCON is going to influence what you can do in the world, where you can coup, where you can realign. And if ever a player causes the DEFCON to go to 0, then the person whose turn it was that caused it to go to 0 is going to lose the game instantly. So those are a couple ways to win. There's also a scoring at the end of the game. If you make it through all 10 The game calls them turns again, but round seems like more appropriate. But basically, all the way to the end of the game. You'll also see this early war, mid-war, late war. It's because the game comes with 3 decks of cards. The early war events are going to happen first. Then eventually, when you get to turn 4, you're going to shuffle this second deck in, and when you get to turn 8, you're going to shuffle a third deck in. And it's also important to note that some of these events here are going to have this red text at the bottom and an asterisk by them. And when you play that card and its event occurs, the card is removed from the game. It never comes back in, whereas other cards that don't have that, or if the card is not used for its event, it's going to stay in the game and come back every time the deck is reshuffled. And then that's kind of it, right? It's in concept, it's very simple. But learning this game can take a bit of work. And so with that, I'm going to kind of stop talking about how the game works and go on to some of my thoughts about it. So what makes Twilight Struggle special? Well, the number one thing is the theme here. This is one of the most thematic games that there is. Even though it seems like putting counters out on a board, each card has a historical event that it's evoking, and the game comes with a rule book, a historical appendix where you can go through and look up each card and see exactly what happened at the Yalta conference, or at the kitchen debates, or at there's a card about Dr. Strangelove, or you can read about that. And so that's there's a lot of history in the game, and there's even more if you want to go through and kind of look up the way things go. Because Cold War, right? I mean, I was born kind of toward the end of the Cold War, but it was definitely something that was still alive and talked about. I don't know if the kids are learning about it that much these days in school, but we definitely did. And it was really, all these historical events are things that we learned about in high school. And so it's kind of interesting to sort of see how they play out and to make them play out to your advantage. I've learned history from playing this game. It makes you want to know more about these things, and there's very few games that do that. So the theme here is just so well evoked. Another thing is that the gameplay in this game is extremely tense, right? Any turn that you do something wrong, your opponent could gain the momentum they need to steamroll you. And so you have to be very careful. And it can be nerve-wracking as you have a hand of all cards that are just going to benefit your opponent. And the instant sort of initial reaction to that is going to be, well, why? Why bother? I mean, there's nothing I can do. Except, that the cards are actually fairly balanced. So if you have a bunch of your opponent's cards, they have a bunch of yours. And learning when to play the cards, and especially when to play the cards that are removed from the game, is really fascinating, and it can be really tense. And as you sort of get to that turn where you're at 18 points and you're like, okay, if this goes perfectly, I can win this turn. And then you sort of set up the plan and kind of play this and this and this and sort of see those dominoes start to fall. That can be really exhilarating. A good game of Twilight Struggle that goes all the way to the end is one of the best gaming experiences you will ever have. Now, sure, it can end early. And we'll talk about that in the the negatives, but figuring out how to make this work and just sort of riding that train as you slowly and subtly influence countries and make your mark in different areas of the world, it is a high like no other. I mentioned subtlety. This is a war game. It's from GMT, which is really a war game publisher. But it's the Cold War, which isn't sort of a go in guns a-blazing type of affair. It's very subtle. You're slowly influencing things. It's a game of inches, right? You're just slightly getting ahead here and slightly getting ahead there and setting a trap for your opponent here and, having one sprung on you there. And so it's really, it can be really exciting to sort of slowly see your master plan unfold. So the game is fun. It's unlike anything else. It's super evocative. The rules are not that hard. Okay, I will talk about the learning curve in a moment, but the actual rules, the 4 or so things that you can do on your turn, it's pretty easy. You pick one and you do it. And the rest of the game is learning how to apply those rules and how to sort of figure out how to deal with those events. So it sounds like I didn't say very many things that were special, but that's because I'm trying to hurry to talk about more things. I want to talk briefly about some of the buts. So there are, I guess, three problems with Twilight Struggle. Problem number one, the game is ugly. I mean, it is a very low quality production. Even the deluxe edition, I remember the deluxe edition came with a board rather than a paper mat. It's from GMT, which generally produces very low quality products. It's not what their market is looking for, I guess. But I mean, the card quality is it's okay, right? These cards are fine. Mine are sleeved in the big game, but it's fine. The artwork is okay. It's usually just sort of some clip art or a screenshot or a picture from a history book somewhere. Usually black and white. Um, that one was in color, but for example, this is perhaps a better example of it. It's usually just sort of a snapshot from something historical. Nothing really to write home about or remember. The tokens themselves that come with the base game are kind of, they're thick cardboard. They're nice quality, but they're very boring, right? I mean, it's a star, and, on the other side, it's colored to show control. And then there's the sort of hammer and sickle for the Soviet player. You can see them in here. But they're nothing really very memorable. The other pieces are functional and fine. But the game board itself, and I wanted to kind of show that, and this is an intentional choice, but the game board itself, as you may have noticed early, is not all that interesting, right? It's just a map with a bunch of spots that are kind of in the wrong spot sometimes. And then over here, you'll see this. It looks like somebody put a cup of coffee on it. There's this water stain, and that is by design. That's not there accidentally. That's on every copy. It comes. Oh, I guess I forgot to add that to the stream. You've got this sort of a stain here. It's really not a very good looking game. It's functional but ugly. The second problem with Twilight Struggle is the rule book. It is written like a technical manual. Section 3.1.2, you can find out the rules for this, and this applies unless overridden by 1.4. And learning to play from the rule book is really quite difficult. I did it. There's actually a playthrough that you can kind of use to learn the game, but it is a difficult game to learn from the rule book. It's a game that's much better to be taught. And that brings me to point number three. And point number three is the biggest point against it. And that is that there is an enormously steep learning curve. See, because all these cards do different things, if you have played the game before a few times and can remember, sort of what some of the cards are and what some of the events that are yet to come, you're going to win, right? You'll know what to plan for. The example that people give is there's the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Pact, which basically says kick the Soviet player out of Japan. And so if you are the Soviet player and you don't know that that's coming, you could potentially waste a lot of turns getting in control of Japan, only to have that card come up, be played against you, and wipe out several turns of work. And there are lots of events like that, especially involved. The Japan one's a well-known one, but there's lots that are more subtle. And there's some events that, you don't ever want to play, but some people who are newer might play them and do things wrong. It's a game you can mess up because you don't have the background. And so you really have to approach a game of Twilight Struggle understanding that that's a possibility, understanding that it's a possibility that you might just be totally hosed by someone. Now, typically, there's a couple of mitigating ways to mitigate that. One way is generally the Soviet player is a little bit stronger early on, whereas the U.S. player is a little bit stronger toward the end. So if you're playing with a new person, you can give them the Soviets to give them a little bit of an edge. The other way is that there's the late war variant, which changes the rules somewhat and sort of focuses only on the last three rounds of the game. And in that, the balance is actually pretty good. The Soviet player is trying to hold on to one single solitary point, while the U.S. player really needs to steamroll to win. And I think that's a good way to learn the game. In fact, that's my preferred way to teach the game is with the late war variant, just because it gives you a preview of how Twilight Struggle is going to work without setting you up for a long game where you slowly lose for a couple hours. So those are really the three negatives. The ugliness is not might be by design because it's been through lots of editions and it's still ugly. The rule book is definitely a knock against it, and then sort of the learning curve. Some people might think is a positive, right? It's a game you will get better at if you're willing to invest the time. So let's go on to my final rating. And it should not be a surprise if you've ever seen my top 100 lists. This game is a perfect 10 out of 10 for me. Until Summoner Wars came along, this was my favorite game of all time. I mean, this is a game that I have played lots and that it gives me a high like no other, as I said before. This is close to perfect for me. This is about as good as it gets. I really like Twilight Struggle. I don't know that it's for everyone, though, right? It is only a two-player game, which means that, if you normally have four people, are two people going to watch you play Twilight Struggle? And then another thing I wanted to mention, though, is it came out, and I mentioned this at the beginning, with Twilight Struggle Light, the Red Sea edition. And whereas I rate Twilight Struggle a 10 out of 10, I think I give Red Sea a 5 out of 10. And the reason for that is that it is too short. Whereas Twilight Struggle is a long game that spans an hour and a half to 2 hours. And if you play the full game, your decisions matter. The cards that you remove from the game matter. The areas that you get ahead in matter. Everything you do, every decision you make is setting you up for victory or failure. In this short version, it's only 2 rounds. You never reshuffle the deck. So the cards you play, regardless of whether they're removed from play or not, they're just always gone. Every time you play a card, it's gone. You'll never see it again. And so that decision of when to trigger events and when not to matters a whole lot less. There is a rule, there's a variant to play with 3 rounds, but that somehow requires you to pull out your copy of Twilight Struggle and pull a bunch of cards out and put them in this one, which I don't want to do. That doesn't sound fun. That sounds like a lot of work. So this short version, this Red Sea version, is meant to be a half-hour game that you can kind of play at lunchtime, and it's on a smaller board, and it's easier to set up. I will give it those things, but it just doesn't have, it has all the same rules, but none of the joy. It's all of the struggle, none of the joy. It kind of honestly feels like the kind of game you would play, the demo you'd play at a convention, sort of to get a taste of how it works, how the different card play works, and how the different rules work. And then that would be, to buy the full game and have the full experience. So I was shockingly disappointed by this short version because it is a short and worse version of a game I love. I was hoping for something that would be like, all of the fun of Twilight Struggle in 30 minutes. Sign me up. I will play that every time. I thought it would replace Twilight Struggle. But no, what it did was it underscored how immaculately designed regular Twilight Struggle is, and how it's just sort of a high that is difficult to chase. I will say that there are rules where you can kind of import these cards into your game of Twilight Struggle. That, of course, requires taking other cards out, which doesn't sound like very much fun, but that might be interesting to try to sort of have different events in there. Maybe I'll try that as a variant sometime, but as a whole, Twilight Struggle is an A triple plus, and Red Sea is a D. I mean, honestly, that's just how I feel. So who is Twilight Struggle for? I don't think this is a game everybody should own. It is a game that looks boring. If you don't like history or don't love history, this might not be for you. If your group is regularly more than 2 players, this game's probably not for you. If you don't want to spend the time kind of make this investment in learning a game so that you can play it properly, probably not for you. It's definitely not a casual game for families. But if you are a person who loves really heavy strategy games where you can kind of take something and ride it through, pick a path and sort of slowly inch your way toward that victory. If you like game with a lot of tactical choices of, when am I going to play this? What am I going to do with it? And reacting to what your opponent does and trying to sort of read them and figure out what they have and sort of see, okay, are they preparing for this event? Are they preparing for this scoring? Those things, if you like that, if you like to sort of play mind reader in games, this is totally for you. Like I said, it is a 10 out of 10 for me, so it's totally for me. And it's one that I I have the deluxe edition. That's again why I didn't show it, because I have the deluxe edition and it's upstairs and it's in this huge wooden chest. And it's not that deluxe. I had to buy the extra board game key components for it. It's probably the least deluxe edition you'll ever see, but it is in a heavy wooden chest, and I like that. I will also say that there is a fantastic app implementation. So if you wanted to play Twilight Struggle but didn't necessarily want to buy the game, punch it out, set it up, learn the rules, there's an app that you can kind of play, and it has a couple of the variants in there. And it's a great way to kind of learn and experience the game and also practice at it a little bit so that you can kind of learn what the cards are before trying it against your friend that's waiting to teach you so that he can trounce you. Uh, so I recommend the app for anyone who's curious. I recommend the game for people who are really serious about it. And I recommend something else if if this doesn't sound like it's for you, if you don't like history, you want to play with young children or a family, or just really don't want to invest a lot of time in the game, this might be a pass. But again, 10 out of 10 for me. And so with that brings us to the end of another episode of Wednesday Whimsy. I will be back again next week. I'm not sure what I'm talking about yet. I have a suspicion, but we will see when that occurs. So until then, I'm going to wish you safe travels, courage when you need it, and I will see you next time on another episode of Wednesday Whimsy. Bye-bye.